The small town of Willowbrook was wrapped in a thick blanket of gray clouds on that cold, quiet morning. The air carried a heaviness that seemed to press down on everyone's shoulders as they gathered at St. Mary's Cemetery. It was the kind of day where even the birds stayed silent, leaving only the rustling leaves and occasional sniffles to break the stillness. Today they were here to say goodbye to Jonathan Reed, a man who had been more than just a mechanic. He was a friend, a neighbor, and someone who always went out of his way to help others. Jonathan wasn't rich or famous. He didn't have grand stories to tell or trophies lining his shelves. But what he did have was a heart full of kindness. Whether it was fixing a car for free when someone couldn't afford repairs or lending an ear to a struggling soul, Jonathan made sure no one felt alone. So, when news spread that he had died in a fire at his workshop, the whole town mourned. People whispered about how unfair it was. How could such a good man be taken so suddenly? At the center of it all stood Emily, Jonathan's teenage daughter. She was only 15, with wide blue eyes that always seemed to notice things others missed. Today, though, those eyes were red and swollen from crying. Clutching a faded photograph of her father tightly in her hands, she stood beside her mother, Claire. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, but there was something else behind her expression, a flicker of determination that no one else seemed to catch. As the pastor began speaking, his words floated over the crowd like a soft breeze. Today, we gather to honor the life of Jonathan Reed. His voice trailed off into the background as murmurs rippled through the mourners. Some spoke fondly of Jonathan's generosity, while others lamented the tragedy of losing him so soon. Everyone agreed it was heartbreaking. But then, just as the casket was being lowered into the ground, something unexpected happened. Emily stepped forward, her small frame trembling under the weight of what she was about to say. For a moment she hesitated, glancing around at the sea of faces staring back at her. Then, taking a deep breath, she spoke up, her voice shaky but clear. "My dad isn't dead," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. The reaction was immediate. Gasps echoed across the cemetery, followed by stunned silence. Even the wind seemed to stop blowing for a second. The priest froze mid-prayer, his Bible hanging loosely in his hand. Dozens of eyes locked onto Emily, disbelief etched onto every face. How could she say such a thing? They'd seen the charred remains themselves. The authorities had ruled it an accident. What was going on? Emily didn't waver. Instead, she repeated herself, this time with more conviction. "He's alive. I know he is." Her words hung in the air like a challenge, daring anyone to argue with her. Yet no one did. Not right away, anyway. The silence stretched on, broken only by the distant sound of a crow cawing somewhere in the distance. Finally, someone muttered, "Poor girl. She must be in shock." Others nodded sympathetically, assuming grief had clouded her judgment. After all, it wasn't uncommon for people to cling to hope in moments like these. Losing a loved one was hard, especially for a child. But Emily didn't look like a girl lost in denial. There was fire in her eyes, a stubborn certainty that refused to fade. She glanced down at the photograph in her hands, tracing the edges with her fingers. It was an old picture, worn from years of being carried around, but it meant everything to her. Deep inside, she felt it, a pull, a whisper telling her that her father was still out there waiting for her to find him. Little did anyone know, Emily wasn't just speaking blindly. Over the past few nights, she'd been having vivid dreams. Dreams where her father appeared to her calm and reassuring, urging her not to give up. In one dream, he'd told her something specific, something strange, but unforgettable. "Look under the oak tree," he'd said. At first, Emily thought it was just her mind playing tricks on her. But the more she thought about it, the stronger the feeling became. This wasn't just a random dream, it was a message, and if she wanted answers, she needed to follow it. For now, though, the crowd remained unconvinced. As the service ended and people began filing out of the cemetery, murmurs of pity followed Emily wherever she went. Some patted her shoulder gently, offering empty condolences. Others exchanged worried looks, wondering if she'd need counseling after this. No one believed her, not yet anyway, except for one person. Standing near the edge of the gathering, a detective assigned to oversee the case watched Emily closely. He'd been observing quietly throughout the service, jotting down notes and listening to the whispers around him. Something about the girl's conviction intrigued him. Sure, it was possible she was overwhelmed by grief. But what if she wasn't? What if there was truth buried beneath her words? As the last of the mourners drifted away, the detective approached Emily and her mother. With a respectful nod, he introduced himself and asked if they wouldn't mind answering a few questions. Emily met his gaze steadily, her chin lifted slightly in defiance. Whatever doubts the rest of the world had, she knew what she felt, and she was ready to prove them wrong. And so, without realizing it, the wheels of a much bigger mystery began to turn. The whispers started almost immediately after the funeral ended. People gathered in small groups near their cars, shaking their heads and exchanging glances. "Did you hear what she said?" One woman murmured to her friend, her voice barely above a whisper. "She thinks he's still alive." Her friend shook her head sadly, patting her chest as if trying to steady her own emotions. "Poor thing. She's just a kid. Losing her dad like that. It must have broken her." Emily heard bits and pieces of these conversations as she walked back to her mother's car. Each word felt like a tiny jab, pricking at something deep inside her. She clenched her fists tightly, her nails digging into her palms, but she didn't say anything. What could she say? They wouldn't believe her. Not yet. But she knew what she'd felt when she stood there by the grave. That pull, that certainty, it wasn't something you could explain to someone who hadn't experienced it themselves. Her mother, Claire, tried to comfort her on the ride home. She reached over and placed a hand on Emily's knee, her touch gentle but firm. "Sweetheart," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I know this is hard for you. It's hard for me, too. But we have to face the truth. Your father—" She paused, swallowing hard before continuing. "We saw the remains, Emily, the fire. It was terrible. There's no way—" "No," Emily interrupted sharply, surprising even herself with how forceful her tone sounded. She turned to look at her mother, her blue eyes blazing with emotion. "Mom, I'm telling you, he's not dead. He can't be. I feel it. And he told me—" Claire frowned, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "Told you? Told you what?" Emily hesitated. Should she tell her about the dreams? About the strange message her father had given her? She wanted to trust her mom, but something held her back. Maybe it was the doubt in Claire's voice, or maybe it was the fear of being dismissed again. Instead, she simply shook her head. "It doesn't matter. Just don't give up on him, okay?" Claire sighed deeply, looking torn between frustration and sorrow. "Emily, I want to believe you, I really do, but sometimes life isn't fair. Sometimes people leave us and we don't get answers." The rest of the drive passed in silence, heavy and suffocating. When they finally arrived home, Emily retreated to her room, shutting the door behind her. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring blankly at the wall. Her mind raced with questions. Why wouldn't anyone listen to her? Was she truly the only one who believed her father was alive? And most importantly, what did the message mean? "Look under the oak tree." It had to mean something. Her father wouldn't have said it otherwise. Later that evening, there was a knock at the door. Emily peeked out of her room to see her mother speaking with someone, a man wearing a suit. He looked official, with a notebook in his hand and a calm, thoughtful expression on his face. Emily recognized him from the funeral. He was the detective who had been watching her closely during the service. Something about him made her uneasy, not in a bad way, but in a way that told her he wasn't going to let things slide easily. Curiosity got the better of her, and she crept closer, listening, from the hallway as her mother invited him inside. "Thank you for coming," Claire said, her voice polite but tinged with exhaustion. "I hope you can help us understand everything." The detective nodded, taking a seat at the kitchen table. "Of course. That's why I'm here. I know, this is a difficult time for both of you, and I want to make sure we're thorough in our investigation. especially since he glanced toward Emily, who was hovering just out of sight. Well, your daughter mentioned something interesting today. Claire sighed, rubbing her temples. Yes, she seems convinced her father is still alive, but honestly, I think it's just grief talking. The detective leaned forward slightly, his expression serious but kind. You might be right. Grief can make people cling to hope in ways that aren't always rational. But he paused, choosing his words carefully. Sometimes hope has a reason behind it. Has Emily shared anything specific with you? Any details that might explain why she believes this? Claire shook her head. Not really. She keeps saying she feels it, but that's all. The detective nodded slowly, then turned his attention toward the hallway where Emily was hiding. Emily, he called out gently. I know you're there. Would you mind joining us? I'd like to hear more about what you said earlier. For a moment, Emily considered staying put. She didn't owe this stranger anything, did she? But then she remembered the look in his eyes, the way he seemed genuinely interested in what she had to say. Taking a deep breath, she stepped into the kitchen and pulled up a chair beside her mother. So, the detective began, folding his hands on the table. You said your father is alive. Can you tell me why you believe that? Emily hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal, but something about the detective's calm demeanor put her at ease. Slowly, she began to speak. It's not just a feeling, she explained, her voice quieter now but still steady. I've been having dreams about my dad. He talks to me in them. He tells me things. The detective raised an eyebrow, intrigued. What kind of things? Emily swallowed hard. This was the part she wasn't sure about sharing. But she decided to take the leap. Last night, he told me to look under the oak tree, the big one, in our backyard. He said it was important. There was a long pause as the detective processed her words. Then, without missing a beat, he stood up and grabbed his coat. Let's go take a look, he suggested. If there's even a chance this could lead somewhere, we need to check it out. Claire looked skeptical, but she didn't argue. Together, the three of them headed outside, flashlights in hand. The oak tree loomed large against the darkening sky, its branches swaying gently in the breeze. Emily led the way, stopping directly beneath its sprawling canopy. Here, she said, pointing to the base of the tree. This is where he told me to look. The detective knelt down, inspecting the ground carefully. After a few moments, he spotted something unusual, a patch of soil that looked slightly disturbed, as though it had been dug up recently. Without hesitation, he pulled out a small trowel from his pocket and began to dig. Emily watched anxiously, her heart pounding in her chest. What if she was wrong? What if this was all just a wild goose chase, but then the trowel hit something solid? The detective stopped and brushed away the dirt, revealing the corner of a metal box buried beneath the surface. Everyone froze, staring at it in stunned silence. Slowly, he lifted the box out of the ground and opened it, revealing stacks of cash, fake IDs, and documents detailing offshore accounts. Claire gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. What is this? She stammered, her voice shaking. Emily stared at the contents of the box, her mind racing. None of it made sense. Her father wasn't the type of person to get involved in something shady. So why would he have these things? Unless he didn't do this, Emily said firmly, interrupting the tense silence. Someone set him up. I know it. The detective studied the items carefully, his brow furrowed in thought. These IDs, they bear his likeness, but the dates suggest they were created months ago, before the fire. He glanced at Emily, his expression unreadable. Your father may have been caught up in something bigger than any of us realized. As the weight of the discovery settled over them, Emily felt a surge of determination. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. If her father was alive, she was going to find him, no matter what it took. The metal box sat on the kitchen table, its contents spread out like pieces of a puzzle waiting to be solved. The room was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of papers as the detective sifted through the documents. Emily stood by the doorway, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, staring at the pile of evidence with wide eyes. Her mind buzzed with questions that refused to settle. Who had buried this box? Why did it have her father's face on those fake IDs? And most importantly, what did it all mean? Claire paced back and forth, running a hand through her hair in frustration. I don't understand any of this, she muttered, her voice strained. Jonathan wasn't... He wouldn't... She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. It was clear she wanted to believe her husband was innocent, but the sight of the cash and forged documents made it hard to ignore the possibility that something was terribly wrong. The detective glanced up from the papers, his expression calm, but focused. Let's take this one step at a time, he said, his tone steady. These items don't necessarily prove guilt. They could just as easily be planted or used against him. He tapped one of the fake IDs with his pen. Someone went to great lengths to create these. Whoever did this wanted it to look like your husband was involved in something illegal. Emily nodded slowly, her heart pounding. That made sense. Her father wasn't the kind of person who would ever deal with shady people or break the law. He worked hard, fixed cars, and took care of his family. Something, or someone, had dragged him into this mess. But who? And why? Her thoughts were interrupted when the detective pulled out a small notebook from his coat pocket. Flipping it open, he jotted down a few notes before turning to Claire. Can you think of anyone who might have had a reason to target Jonathan? He asked gently. Anyone he argued with recently? Any unusual behavior? Claire hesitated, biting her lip as she tried to recall anything out of the ordinary. He'd been acting strange lately, she admitted after a moment. Staying out late more often, avoiding phone calls when I walked into the room. I thought maybe he was stressed about work, but now... Her voice broke and she looked away, tears welling up in her eyes. Emily stepped forward, placing a comforting hand on her mother's shoulder. Mom, Dad wouldn't do anything wrong, she said firmly, her voice filled with conviction. If he was hiding something, it's because he was trying to protect us. The detective nodded, scribbling another note. That's a good point. Sometimes people keep secrets not because they're guilty, but because they're scared, or trying to shield their loved ones. He paused, looking directly at Emily. You mentioned earlier that your father spoke to you in dreams. Did he say anything else besides the clue about the oak tree? Emily hesitated, unsure if she should share everything. Part of her still worried they wouldn't believe her. But then she remembered how seriously the detective had taken her so far. If anyone deserved the truth, it was him. Taking a deep breath, she nodded. Yes, she said softly. Last night he told me to trust no one, not even the police. The detective raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. Interesting, he murmured, tapping his pen against the table. And did he explain why? She shook her head. No, but he sounded urgent, like he was warning me. A heavy silence fell over the room as everyone absorbed her words. Trust? No one, not even the police. It was a chilling statement, one that raised more questions than answers. Was someone watching them? Had her father uncovered something dangerous enough to put his life at risk? The detective leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples thoughtfully. All right, he said finally, breaking the silence. If your father felt threatened, we need to figure out what or who he was afraid of. Let's start by retracing his steps leading up to the fire. Maybe we'll find something that connects the dots. Over the next hour, they combed through every detail they could remember about Jonathan's routine. Claire recalled how he'd been working longer hours at the shop, sometimes staying late into the night. Neighbors mentioned seeing unfamiliar cars parked near the workshop in the weeks before the fire. One elderly woman even claimed she'd seen two men arguing with Jonathan outside the garage, but she couldn't describe them clearly beyond saying they looked rough. As the conversation unfolded, Emily noticed something subtle in the detective's demeanor. His movements became sharper, his questions more pointed. Whatever they were uncovering, it seemed to be leading somewhere significant. Finally, he stood up and grabbed his coat. "There's surveillance footage from businesses near the workshop," he explained. "With your permission, I'd like to review it. It might give us a clearer picture of what happened that night." Claire nodded numbly, too overwhelmed to argue. Emily, however, followed him to the door, her curiosity getting the better of her. "Do you really think we'll find something?" she asked, her voice tinged with both hope and fear. The detective smiled faintly, though his eyes remained serious. "We won't know unless we try," he replied. "But I promise you this, I'm not going to stop until we get answers." Later that evening, Emily lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. The events of the day replayed in her mind like a movie she couldn't turn off. The discovery under the oak tree, the fake IDs, the cryptic warnings. It all felt surreal, like some twisted mystery novel come to life. Yet amidst the chaos, one thing remained crystal clear. Her father was alive. She could feel it in her bones, hear it in the whispers of his voice during her dreams. No amount of doubt or disbelief from others could shake that certainty. Just as sleep began to pull at the edges of her consciousness, her phone buzzed quietly on the nightstand. Frowning, she reached for it, expecting a text from her mom checking, and instead, she found a message from an unknown number. Her heart skipped a beat as she read the words. "Stay quiet. Don't trust anyone." Emily froze, her fingers trembling as she stared at the screen. The message was short, almost mundane, but it carried a weight that sent chills down her spine. It was as if whoever sent it knew exactly what she'd been thinking, and they were watching her every move. For a long moment, she debated whether to tell the detective. After all, he'd been supportive so far, treating her instincts with respect, rather than dismissal. But then she remembered her father's warning in the dream. Trust no one. What if sharing the message put him in even greater danger? Taking a shaky breath, Emily locked her phone and slid it under her pillow. For now, she would keep this secret to herself. But one thing was certain. Whatever game they were playing, she wasn't going to back down. Her father needed her, and she wasn't about to let him down. The next morning, Emily woke up with a sense of unease clinging to her like a second skin. The text message from the unknown number still lingered in her mind, its words echoing louder than ever. "Stay quiet. Don't trust anyone." She replayed it over and over, trying to make sense of it. Who had sent it? Was it someone connected to her father? Or worse, was it someone who didn't want her digging any deeper? Her stomach churned as she got dressed and headed downstairs. Her mother was already in the kitchen, sipping coffee while staring blankly at the wall. Claire looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes betraying the sleepless night she'd endured. Emily wanted to say something comforting, but the weight of everything felt too heavy to put into words. Instead, she grabbed a piece of toast and munched on it quietly, avoiding eye contact. Just as they were finishing breakfast, there was a knock at the door. It was the detective. He carried a folder under his arm and wore an expression that suggested he'd been up all night working. When Claire let him in, he wasted no time getting straight to the point. "I reviewed the surveillance footage," he said, setting the folder down on the dining table. "And I think we found something important." Emily's heart skipped a beat. She rushed to the table, pulling out a chair so she could sit closer. "What did you find?" she asked eagerly, leaning forward. The detective opened the folder and pulled out a series of grainy black and white photos printed from the security cameras near Jonathan's workshop. They showed two masked figures approaching the building, shortly before the fire broke out. One of them carried what looked like a gasoline canister, while the other dragged something, or someone, inside. Claire gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. Is that Jonathan?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The detective nodded grimly. "It's hard to tell for sure because of the masks and the poor quality of the footage. But based on the size and build of the person being dragged, it's very likely him." Emily stared at the images, her chest tightening. This wasn't just an accident, it was deliberate. Someone had set the fire on purpose and her father had been their target. A wave of anger surged through her, followed by a fierce determination. Whoever these people were, they weren't going to get away with it. But wait, Emily said suddenly, pointing at one of the photos. Look at his wrist. Everyone leaned in closer, squinting at the image. Sure enough, the figure being dragged wore a distinctive silver bracelet, the same lucky charm her father never took off. Emily's breath hitched as tears welled up in her eyes. That's him, she said firmly, her voice cracking slightly. That's Dad. The room fell silent as the reality sank in. Claire buried her face in her hands, sobbing quietly, while the detective studied the photos again, his jaw clenched. For the first time, there was undeniable proof that Jonathan hadn't perished in the fire. He'd been taken against his will. Later that afternoon, the detective returned with more information. He'd traced the phone number that had sent Emily the mysterious text message earlier that morning. To everyone's surprise, it led to a cheap burner phone purchased from a convenience store miles away from Willowbrook. Even more shocking was the fact that the phone had been used recently, and not just to send messages. There were traces of calls made to numbers linked to a local crime syndicate known for extortion, money laundering, and other shady dealings. This changes things, the detective said, pacing back and forth in the living room. Your husband wasn't just caught in the crossfire of something random. He stumbled onto something big, something dangerous, and now they're using him to keep others quiet. Emily listened intently, her fists clenched tightly. So what happens next? She demanded, her voice sharp with urgency. Are we going to find him or not? The detective stopped pacing and turned to face her. We are, he said firmly. But we need to be careful. These people are dangerous, and if they realize we're onto them... He trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. Claire, who had been sitting silently on the couch, finally spoke up. What about Jonathan? If he's alive, where could they be keeping him? The detective hesitated, then pulled out another document from his folder. It was a bank statement showing recent activity from one of the offshore accounts tied to Jonathan's name. The withdrawal had occurred days after the fire, and hundreds of miles away from Willowbrook. They moved him, Emily said softly, piecing it together. They took him somewhere else? The detective nodded. That's my guess. And wherever he is, we need to act fast. Every minute counts. As night fell, Emily found herself alone in her room, staring out the window at the darkened streets below. Her mind raced with possibilities. Where would they take her father? How could they track him down without tipping off the people holding him captive? And most importantly, how could she convince the detective to let her help? She knew she couldn't sit idly by while someone else decided her father's fate. This was her family, her fight. She had to be part of it, no matter what. Suddenly, her phone buzzed again. Startled, she picked it up and saw another message from the same unknown number. You're asking too many questions. Stop before it's too late. Her blood ran cold. They were watching her. Somehow they knew she was involved, but instead of fear, a spark of defiance ignited within her. Let them watch. Let them try to stop her. She wasn't giving up, not when her father needed her. With newfound resolve, Emily slipped her phone into her pocket and tiptoed downstairs. The detective was still in the living room, poring over maps and notes. When he saw her standing there, he raised an eyebrow. Shouldn't you be asleep? He asked gently. I can't, she replied, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. I need to help, please. You don't know my dad like I do. I can see things, notice details that might slip past you. I'm not just some kid. I'm his daughter. For a long moment, the detective studied her, his expression unreadable. Then slowly he nodded. All right, he said, but you follow my lead. No heroics. Understand? Emily nodded, relief washing over her. Finally, she was being taken seriously. Finally, she was being allowed to step into the role she'd been preparing for since the moment she realized her father was still alive. Together, they began planning their next move. The detective flagged key locations based on the bank withdrawal and cross-referenced them with areas known for criminal activity. Meanwhile, Emily jotted down memories of her father's habits, places he liked to visit, routes he often took, anything that might provide a clue. As they worked side by side, Emily felt a flicker of hope ignite within her. This wasn't just about finding her father anymore. It was about proving to herself and to everyone else that she wasn't powerless. That even in the face of danger, love and determination could cut through the darkest shadows. And so, armed with scraps of evidence and unwavering courage, they prepared to chase the truth wherever it led. Whatever awaited them, Emily knew one thing for certain: she wouldn't rest until her father was safe. The early morning light filtered through the curtains as Emily and the detective packed their things into a small unmarked car. The air was tense with anticipation, but there was also a glimmer of hope, a fragile thread that neither of them dared to snap. They had spent most of the night piecing together clues, mapping out potential locations where Jonathan might be held captive. Now, it was time to act. As they drove away from the house, Emily glanced back at her mother standing on the porch, arms crossed tightly over her chest. Claire's face was pale, her eyes filled with worry. She hadn't wanted Emily to go, not after everything she'd already been through. But deep down she knew her daughter couldn't stay behind. This wasn't just about finding Jonathan anymore. It was about bringing him home together as a family. "Are you ready for this?" the detective asked, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a mix of caution and determination. Emily nodded firmly, clutching the strap of her backpack in her lap. "I have to be," she replied, her tone steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "He's my dad. I can't let him down." Their first stop was a rundown motel on the outskirts of town, a place flagged by the detective after tracing the burner phone used to send Emily the threatening messages. It wasn't much to look at. Faded paint peeling off the walls, flickering, neon signs advertising vacancies, and a parking lot littered with cigarette butts and empty soda cans. But something about it felt wrong, like the kind of place people went when they didn't want to be found. The detective parked a few spaces away from the office entrance, keeping the engine running. "Stay here," he instructed, turning to Emily. "If anything happens, anything, I want you to lock the doors and call for backup, understand?" She hesitated, wanting to argue, but one look at his serious expression silenced her protests. Reluctantly, she nodded. "Okay," she murmured, watching as he stepped out of the car. Inside the motel office, the detective flashed his badge at the clerk, a wiry man with greasy hair and tired eyes. "I'm looking for someone who rented a room recently," he said, sliding a photo of the burner phone across the counter. "Does this belong to anyone staying here?" The clerk squinted at the image before shrugging. "Could be room 12, he muttered, scratching his chin. "Guy paid in cash, kept to himself, haven't seen him since yesterday, though." The detective thanked him and headed toward room 12, his hand resting lightly on the holster of his gun. When he reached the door, he knocked sharply, calling out, "Police, open up!" No response. After a moment, he tried the handle. It was unlocked. Pushing the door open slowly, he stepped inside, scanning the dimly lit space. The room was a mess, clothes scattered across the floor, empty food wrappers crumpled on the bedside table, and a half-empty bottle of cheap whiskey sitting on the dresser. But what caught his attention was the trash bin overflowing with papers. Kneeling down, he sifted through the contents. Among the discarded receipts and wrappers were documents detailing recent transactions linked to the offshore accounts tied to Jonathan's name. There were also handwritten notes scribbled hastily on scraps of paper, mentioning names, dates, and locations. One phrase stood out: "Warehouse near Chicago." Back in the car, Emily leaned forward eagerly as the detective showed her the findings. "This has to mean something," she said, pointing at the note. "They wouldn't write it down unless it mattered." "You're right," he agreed, nodding thoughtfully. "Let's head there next." The drive to Chicago was long and quiet, punctuated only by the hum of the tires against the highway and the occasional update from the detective as he cross-referenced maps and intel on his phone. Emily stared out the window, her mind racing with possibilities. What would they find at the warehouse? Would her father be there? And if he wasn't, then where? Every mile brought them closer to answers, but also to danger. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every passing car, every shadow lurking in the distance seemed suspicious. Yet she forced herself to focus, reminding herself why they were doing this. For her father. For her family. When they finally arrived at the warehouse late that evening, the sight sent chills down Emily's spine. It was an old, abandoned building tucked away in an industrial area, its windows boarded up and its walls covered in graffiti. The air smelled faintly of rust and decay, and the only sound was the distant hum of traffic from a nearby road. "This is it," the detective whispered, cutting the engine. He turned to Emily, his expression grave. "Listen to me carefully. We don't know what's waiting for us inside. If things go south, I need you to stay close and do exactly what I say. No exceptions." Emily swallowed hard, nodding. Her heart was pounding so loudly she was sure he could hear it. But she refused to back down. Not now. Not when they were this close. Together they approached the warehouse cautiously, the detective leading the way with his flashlight drawn. The heavy metal door creaked as they pushed it open, revealing a cavernous interior bathed in shadows. Dust hung thick in the air, catching the beam of light as they moved deeper inside. That's when they saw it. A makeshift living space hidden behind stacks of crates and old machinery. A mattress lay on the floor, surrounded by blankets and pillows. Empty water bottles and canned food lined a nearby shelf, along with a collection of tools and other supplies. But what stopped Emily in her tracks was the wall. Covering nearly every inch of it were newspaper clippings, maps, and handwritten notes, all meticulously organized into sections. Some clippings mentioned local crimes and corruption scandals, while others highlighted key players involved in the syndicate. Strings connected various points, forming a web of connections that made Emily's head spin. And then, in bold letters scrawled across the center of the wall, was a chilling message. "They're watching. Don't trust anyone." Emily's breath hitched as she read the words aloud. It was the same warning her father had given her in her dreams, and the same one the mysterious texter had sent her earlier. Suddenly pieces began falling into place. Jonathan hadn't been working with these people, he'd been investigating them. He'd uncovered something big, something dangerous enough to put his life at risk. He was trying to expose them, Emily whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "That's why they took him." The detective nodded grimly, examining the notes more closely. "Whoever did this didn't count on your father being smart enough to cover his tracks, or brave enough to fight back." But as they continued searching, Emily noticed something tucked under the mattress, a small journal. Picking it up, she flipped through the pages, her eyes widening with each entry. It was her father's handwriting, detailing everything he'd discovered about the syndicate, including plans to gather evidence and share it with the authorities. In one entry, he wrote, "I've made copies of all the files and hidden them in case something happens to me. If I don't make it, I need, someone to finish what I started." Tears streamed down Emily's face as she clutched the journal to her chest. Her father wasn't just alive. He was counting on her to save him, to carry on his mission. "We'll find him," the detective promised, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll bring him home." For the first time since the nightmare began, Emily allowed herself to believe it. With the journal in hand and her father's courage fueling her resolve, she knew they were closer than ever to unraveling the truth, and putting an end to the darkness threatening to consume them all. The discovery of the journal at the warehouse felt like finding a map in the middle of a storm. Each page was filled with her father's thoughts, fears, and plans, a lifeline connecting Emily to him even though he wasn't there. As she flipped through it again, sitting on the cold concrete floor of the warehouse, she noticed something new. A list of locations scribbled hastily in the margins. Some were crossed out, others circled multiple times for emphasis. One stood out more than the rest, a remote cabin marked with the words "Last Resort." "This has to be it," Emily said, her voice shaking slightly as she pointed to the entry. If they took him somewhere safe, or somewhere hidden, it would be here. The detective crouched beside her, studying the journal intently. His brow furrowed as he traced his finger over the address scrawled beneath the note. It's risky, he admitted after a moment. If this is where they're keeping him, they'll be expecting trouble. We can't just walk in blind. Emily looked up at him, her blue eyes blazing with determination. Then we don't walk in blind, we plan, but we can't wait too long, they could move him again. He nodded slowly, acknowledging the urgency in her voice. All right, he said, standing up and brushing dust off his knees. Let's regroup and figure out our next steps. First thing tomorrow morning, we'll head out. That night, back at a motel near the warehouse, Emily couldn't sleep. The weight of everything pressed down on her. The journal clutched tightly in her hands, the images of her father tied up and dragged into the fire flashing through her mind. She replayed every word he'd written, searching for anything she might have missed, but one sentence kept echoing louder than the rest. They're watching. Don't trust anyone. What if they were already onto them? What if their every move was being tracked? Her heart raced at the thought, but instead of fear, she felt anger bubbling inside her. These people had taken her father, manipulated him, threatened him, and now they were trying to scare her into backing off. Well, they didn't know who they were dealing with. As dawn broke, Emily woke the detective early, unable to wait any longer. Together they packed their things and set off toward the cabin, following the directions Jonathan had jotted down. The drive was tense, the kind of quiet that made your ears ring. Neither of them spoke much, each lost in their own thoughts. Emily stared out the window, clutching the journal like a talisman, while the detective focused on the road ahead, his jaw clenched tightly. When they finally arrived, the cabin loomed eerily before them. It was nestled deep in the woods, surrounded by towering trees that blocked out most of the sunlight. A thin trail of smoke curled lazily from the chimney, and the windows were dark, giving no indication of life inside. Still, Emily's instincts screamed that they weren't alone. Stay behind me, the detective instructed, pulling out his flashlight and gun as they approached the front door. And remember what I said. If anything goes wrong, run. She nodded, though she had no intention of running. Not without her father. The door creaked open easily, revealing a dimly lit interior. The air smelled musty, like damp wood and old furniture. They moved cautiously, sweeping the rooms one by one. At first it seemed empty, just an old table, a couple of chairs, and a ratty couch covered in blankets. But then, as they reached the back room, they heard it. A faint groan. Emily froze, her breath catching in her throat. The sound came again, weaker this time, but unmistakable. Without waiting for the detective, she bolted forward, throwing open the door to reveal a horrifying sight. Her father lay on the floor, bound and gagged, his face pale and gaunt. His clothes were torn and bruises covered his arms and neck, but his eyes, those familiar warm eyes, lit up when he saw her. Tears streamed down Emily's face as she dropped to her knees beside him, pulling the gag from his mouth. Emily, he whispered hoarsely, his voice barely audible. I knew you'd come. I told you I wouldn't give up, she choked out, hugging him tightly despite the ropes cutting into his wrists. I promised. The detective appeared moments later, quickly freeing Jonathan from his restraints. We need to get you out of here, he said firmly, helping him to his feet. Can you walk? Jonathan nodded weakly, leaning heavily on Emily for support. Just give me a minute, he murmured, wincing as pain shot through his body. They've been drugging me, making sure I couldn't escape. Anger burned hot in Emily's chest as she helped him toward the door. Whoever had done this to him would pay. Every bruise, every scar, it was proof of how far these people would go to protect their secrets. And now, thanks to her father's bravery, they had evidence to bring them down. But as they stepped outside, the calm of the forest was shattered by the sound of approaching footsteps. Heavy boots crunched against the leaves, growing louder with each second. Emily's heart sank as she turned to see 3 men emerging from the shadows. their faces grim and their intentions clear. "Well, well," one of them sneered, stepping forward. "Looks like we've got some unexpected visitors." The detective immediately positioned himself between them and the group, raising his gun. "Back off," he commanded, his voice sharp and commanding. "You're outnumbered." The man laughed, bitterly, glancing at his companions before turning back to the detective. "You think this ends here? You have no idea who you're messing with." Jonathan stepped forward, surprising everyone. Though weak and injured, his voice rang with authority. "It's over," he said firmly, holding up the journal. "Everything's in here, the files, the names, the connections. If anything happens to us, the world will know exactly who you are." For a moment, silence hung heavy in the air. Then, slowly, the men began to back away, exchanging uneasy glances. Whatever confidence they'd walked in with had evaporated, replaced by uncertainty and fear. "Let's go," the leader muttered, motioning for his men to retreat. Within seconds, they disappeared into the woods, leaving the four of them alone. Emily exhaled sharply, her legs trembling beneath her. She hadn't realized how tightly she'd been holding her breath until now. Turning to her father, she threw her arms around him once more, refusing to let go. "You did it," he whispered, stroking her hair gently. "You found me." "No," she corrected, pulling back to look him in the eye. "We did it. Together." As they made their way back to the car, the sun breaking through the clouds for the first time in days, Emily felt a sense of peace wash over her. The fight wasn't over, not completely. There would still be questions to answer, criminals to catch, and justice to serve. But for now, the most important thing was this. Her father was alive, and nothing, not threats, not danger, not even the darkness, could change that. The drive back to Willowbrook felt like a lifetime, though in reality it only took a few hours. The car was cramped and silent, save for the occasional rustle of fabric or the hum of the tires against the road. Emily sat in the back seat with her father, holding his hand tightly as if afraid he might disappear again. Her father leaned against the window, his face pale but calm, his eyes closed more often than open. He looked exhausted, like someone who had been carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders for far too long. Every so often he'd squeeze Emily's hand gently, offering her a small, reassuring smile. It wasn't much, but it meant everything, to her. For weeks she'd doubted herself, questioned whether she was imagining things, wondered if she was strong enough to face whatever came next. But now, sitting beside him, feeling the warmth of his grip, all those fears melted away. She realized something important. Strength wasn't about never being scared. It was about pushing forward even when you were terrified. Up front, the detective kept glancing at them through the rearview mirror, his expression unreadable. He hadn't said much since they left the cabin, but Emily could tell he was thinking hard. There was still so much to figure out. Who exactly were these men? What did they want from her father? And how deep did their network go? These weren't questions that could be answered overnight, but one thing was clear. Jonathan's discovery had put them all in serious danger. When they finally pulled into the driveway of their home, Claire rushed out of the house, tears streaming down her face. She threw her arms around Jonathan without hesitation, sobbing into his shoulder. "I thought I'd lost you," she choked out, her voice breaking. "I thought—" "You didn't lose me," Jonathan replied softly, wrapping his arms around her. His voice was hoarse, but there was a steadiness to it that reassured everyone. "Not yet." For a moment, the four of them stood there together under the fading sunlight, holding on to each other as if afraid the ground might give way beneath them. It was a rare moment of peace, a fragile bubble of happiness amidst chaos. But it didn't last long. The detective cleared his throat gently, reminding them that they weren't out of the woods yet. "We need to talk," he said, gesturing toward the house. "There are some things your father needs to explain, and we need to decide our next steps." Inside, they gathered around the kitchen table, the same place where they'd first opened the metal box from under the oak tree. The atmosphere, was heavy, charged with tension and unanswered questions. Jonathan sat at the head of the table, looking older than Emily remembered. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for a glass of water, and his voice wavered when he finally began to speak. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," he started, his gaze flickering between Claire and Emily. "It started months ago. I noticed strange patterns while working on cars for certain clients. Money changing hands in parking lots, whispered conversations about deliveries and packages. At first I thought it was just gossip, rumors. But then I saw something I shouldn't have." He paused, taking a shaky breath before continuing. "One night I overheard two men talking about laundering money through fake repair shops. They mentioned names, big ones. Politicians, business owners, people no one would ever suspect. I tried to ignore it, to stay out of it, but..." He shook his head, his jaw tightening. "I couldn't, not after I realized what they were doing, so I started keeping records, photos, notes, anything I could find. I thought maybe I could turn it over to the authorities, expose them." Claire stared at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why didn't you let me help?" "Because I didn't want you involved," Jonathan replied, reaching across the table to take her hand. "If anything happened, to me, I wanted you and Emily to be safe. That's why I hid everything. The box, the journal, the cabin. I thought if I disappeared, you'd think I was dead, and they'd leave you alone." Emily listened intently, her heart aching for her father. She understood why he'd done it, to protect them, but it didn't make the pain of losing him any easier. Still, hearing him say it out loud made her realize how much courage it must have taken to keep fighting even when he thought he was alone. "What happened at the workshop?" the detective asked, leaning forward. "Who set the fire?" Jonathan sighed deeply, rubbing his temples. "They found out somehow. Maybe someone tipped them off, maybe I got careless, I don't know. All I remember is waking up tied to a chair, hearing them argue about what to do with me. One of them suggested killing me right then and there, but another said I was worth more alive. That's when they decided to stage the fire, to make everyone think I was dead." "And the text messages?" Emily chimed in, her voice trembling slightly. "The ones telling me not to trust anyone. Were those from you?" He nodded slowly, guilt flashing across his face. "I managed to sneak a phone call once, hoping you'd understand the warning. I knew they were watching, listening. I couldn't risk giving too much away, but I needed you to stay safe." Emily felt a lump rise in her throat. All this time she'd thought she was imagining things, doubting herself, but her instincts had been right. Her father had been trying to reach her, to guide her, even from captivity. As the night wore on, the conversation shifted to what came next. The detective explained that Jonathan's evidence was enough to bring down several key players in the syndicate, but it wouldn't be easy. These people had connections everywhere, law enforcement included. Every step had to be calculated, every move deliberate. "We'll need backup," the detective said, tapping his pen against the table. "Local authorities won't cut it. This goes higher than anyone realizes." Jonathan nodded grimly, his expression resolute. "Then we'll do whatever it takes. I'm not letting them win. Not after everything they've done." Claire reached over and squeezed his hand, her eyes filled with both fear and admiration. "We're with you," she said firmly. "All of us." Emily felt a surge of pride swell in her chest. This was her family, broken, battered, but unbreakable. Together they had faced the impossible and come out stronger. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as one. Before heading to bed, Emily lingered in the doorway of her father's room, watching as he settled onto the couch. He looked up and caught her eye, smiling faintly. "You saved me, kiddo," he said softly. "I don't know how you did it, but you never gave up." She smiled back, tears welling up in her eyes. "Neither did you," she replied. "And that's what makes you my hero." As she turned off the light and closed the door behind her, Emily knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in weeks, she felt hopeful. They had exposed the darkness, brought it into the light. And as long as they stood together, nothing, not fear, not danger, not even the shadows, could tear them apart. The days that followed were a blur of activity, each moment charged with tension and urgency. The detective worked tirelessly, coordinating with trusted contacts in law enforcement to ensure their next steps were safe and calculated. Jonathan spent hours poring over the journal and evidence he'd gathered, piecing together every detail to build a case strong enough to dismantle the syndicate. Claire stayed by his side, her quiet strength anchoring him when the weight of everything threatened to overwhelm him. And Emily? She became the glue holding them all together, her sharp instincts and unwavering determination guiding them through moments of doubt. It wasn't easy. Every phone call, every meeting, every whispered conversation carried the risk of being overheard. They lived under a constant cloud of paranoia, jumping at every knock on the door or unfamiliar car passing by. But despite the fear, they pressed on. This wasn't just about bringing justice anymore, it was about survival. If they failed, the syndicate would come for them again. And this time, there might not be a second chance. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, the family gathered in the living room. The atmosphere was tense but hopeful. The detective had called an emergency meeting, saying it was time to finalize their plan. When he arrived, carrying a thick folder filled with documents, everyone knew the moment of truth was near. "We've got enough to take them down," he announced, spreading the papers across the coffee table. "Your father's evidence is solid: photos, names, transactions. It's more than enough to expose their operation. But we need to act fast." Jonathan leaned forward, his eyes scanning the documents. "What's the catch?" he asked, his voice steady but cautious. The detective hesitated before answering. "The higher-ups are involved. Politicians, judges, people who can make problems disappear if we're not careful. We'll need to go public with this, to make sure the information gets out before they can silence us." Emily frowned, her mind racing. Going public sounded risky. What if someone tipped them off? What if the syndicate retaliated? She voiced her concerns aloud, her voice trembling slightly. "What happens to us if things go wrong?" The detective met her gaze, his expression serious but reassuring. "That's why we're doing this together. I've reached out to federal agents. They'll provide protection once we release the evidence. But until then, we have to stay smart. No mistakes." Claire reached over and took Emily's hand, squeezing it gently. "We're ready," she said firmly, though her voice betrayed a hint of fear. "Whatever it takes." The plan was set into motion the following morning. With the detective leading the way, they uploaded the files to secure servers, sending copies to journalists, news outlets, and government watchdogs. By midday, the story broke. A massive expose detailing corruption, extortion, and money laundering, involving some of the most powerful figures in the region. The response was immediate and explosive. News anchors scrambled to cover the unfolding scandal, while social media erupted with outrage and disbelief. As the hours ticked by, arrests began rolling in. One by one, key players in the syndicate were taken into custody, their connections unraveling like threads pulled from a sweater. It was chaos. But it was controlled chaos. For the first time in months, Emily felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they were going to win. But victory came at a cost. That night, as the family sat together in the safety of their home, surrounded by federal agents keeping watch outside, Jonathan finally allowed himself to break down. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Claire wrapped her arms around him, whispering words of comfort while Emily sat quietly beside them, holding his hand tightly. "I'm sorry," he choked out after a while, his voice raw with emotion. "I never wanted any of you to get dragged into this mess. I thought I could handle it alone." "You didn't," Emily interrupted softly, her voice firm despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. "And you shouldn't have had to. We're your family. That means we fight together. Or, not at all." Her words hung in the air, simple yet profound. They weren't just survivors. They were warriors. Each of them had faced their darkest fears and refused to back down. Together, they had uncovered the truth, exposed the lies, and reclaimed their lives. In the weeks that followed, life slowly began to return to normal, or as close to normal as it could be after everything they'd been through. The syndicate's operations were dismantled, its leaders facing trial for their crimes. Neighbors who had once whispered about Jonathan's supposed death now spoke openly about his bravery, calling him a hero. Emily found herself smiling more often, her laughter echoing through the house again. Claire started planting flowers in the backyard, filling the space with color and life. Even Jonathan, though still healing physically and emotionally, seemed lighter, freer. One afternoon, as Emily stood beneath the old oak tree in their yard, she glanced down at the spot where they'd dug up the metal box. The ground had healed, grass growing back to cover the scar. But she remembered vividly what lay beneath, the secrets, the clues, the beginning of their journey. Kneeling down, she placed her hand on the earth, feeling its warmth beneath her palm. "Thank you," she whispered softly, though she wasn't sure who she was thanking. Maybe her father for fighting so hard. Maybe herself for believing when no one else did. Or maybe the universe for giving them a second chance. As she stood up and turned back toward the house, she caught sight of her parents sitting together on the porch, watching her with proud smiles. In that moment, she realized something important. They weren't just a family anymore, they were a team. A bond forged in fire, tested by shadows, and strengthened by love. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Because sometimes the greatest victories aren't about defeating the darkness, it's about finding the light within yourself and refusing to let it go out.